welcome to the Christmas Horror Story Advent Calendar for 2023. I am Mercedes M. Yardley, and I'm going to be reading you the story Red Frost by Lex H. Jones. Ronald Powell switched off the engine of his black 1941 Packard Clipper and rested the back of his head on the chair. The leather on the headrest was peeling slightly, a small flap catching his neck as he turned towards his companion in the passenger seat. "Are you ready?" he asked. Larry Wilson didn't look ready for much of anything. He was sweating despite the -degree temperature outside, the ice on the floor, and the softly falling snow that marked the season. Larry removed his Trilby hat and wiped his forehead, preventing more sweat dripping into his eyes. When he replaced the hat, Ronald leaned over and pulled the brim down lower, shadowing more of Larry's face. "I think so," Larry shrugged, finally answering the question. "Remind me again why we have to go in? I'm the one with the bum leg. I'm the one who's going to get recognized if anyone's in there." "Nobody's in that factory this time of night, Larry. And yeah, you got a bum leg. So what, you want to be driver instead? Because the way I remember it, you had to sell your car because you didn't drive the damn thing anymore since you took that bullet." "Yeah, I guess." "That's right, you guess. In fact, you don't guess. You know. We both know this is right. They took your job, Larry. 3 years you spent over there fighting the Nazis and the Japanese. Took a bullet for your country, protecting your fellow man, and for what? To get fired from the factory you worked at when you got home, just because you can't move around so well anymore? Bullshit." "They were kind of right, though, Ron. I couldn't." "Bullshit, Larry. They could have found you another job, one where you don't have to walk around. They owe you. The whole damn country owes you. And me too, whilst we're having a gripe about it. I ain't got nothing wrong with me the doctors can fix. It's just a little head problem, that's all. It's called shell shock, Ron. Don't matter what it's called, Larry. It ain't justification for them taking my job. I gave them years before I went off to do my duty, just like you did here, and they stabbed us in the goddamn back. So yeah, now we're taking what we're due. Wouldn't it make more sense to rob the savings and loan? Surely they gotta have more cash than the factory. There's some there, but... More security at the savings and loan, Larry. We've been over this more than once. They expect that place to get robbed. Only folk who know how much money's left in the factory are the folk who have been on the inside one. The ones who know when the bank runs are due to move the cash. Like you, who knows it's not for 2 days, meaning there's a nice fat safe in there, which you know the combination to. They're going to know it's me. Wrong. They might think it's you. What evidence will they have? We're going to invest that money, launder it good, leave them nothing that resembles proof. Innocent until proven guilty, Larry. They might think they know what went down, but their case has got to be airtight. We're decorated vets, remember? You think any judge or jury in the country right now is going to take the side of some rich factory boss over ours? Not a chance in hell. We got this. We'll get away clean and smooth. All right. Just keep an eye on the door for when I come back out. I want to leave as soon as possible. Don't worry about that. The second your ass is back in that seat, my foot's hitting this pedal." Larry took a deep breath, then opened the car door and immediately slipped on the frost-covered ground, bracing himself against the car. "Get it together, you mook!" Ronald yelled. Larry raised his hands in apology, then moved around to the back of the car to open the trunk. He took a gray burlap sack from it, which he slung over his shoulder. After closing the trunk, he walked as quickly as he could toward the factory slide door. His limp was very pronounced. There was no real way he could hide it, but for short spurts like this, he was still surprisingly spry on his feet. It was a long stint of standing and walking, such as his job moving boxes that the factory had required, where he really suffered. Still, despite the speed with which he was able to move for small periods at a time, he was still taking it steady, given the condition of the pavement. The frost had settled thickly overnight, and with the factory being closed over the weekend, nobody had thought it necessary to throw any salt down. The night air seemed to be dropping in temperature with each minute. The key in his hand was so cold that Larry could feel it through his gloves. He shouldn't even still have the key, of course. As the foreman was concerned, he'd handed his keys in on his last day of working there. And he had. There was no deception in that, except for the fact that Larry had got a spare key, which everyone had evidently forgotten about. He'd been lent it when he lost his own, only to then find his own key in the lining of his coat pocket. Nobody had ever thought to ask for the spare back, so Larry had never thought to offer. It was going to come in useful now, though. With his bum leg, there wasn't much chance of Larry being able to force his way through the door with brute effort, and Ronald was too slight a man to be much use in that regard. Being able to simply unlock the door made the whole operation that much easier. Ronald watched as Larry slipped inside the deserted factory, and then glanced at his watch. It was an unnecessary action. They weren't on any set schedule. It wasn't as though a security guard was working the night shift and they needed to time the robbery to avoid his route. The factory didn't even have one. Not at the moment, anyway. The last one had been let go under similar circumstances to Larry, and they'd yet to hire a new one. There was nobody here to avoid, and the factory was too far out from the main roads to chance any passerbys catching them in the act. Still, Ronald naturally felt a sense of urgency that kept drawing his attention back to the ticking watch. After he'd sat for 10 minutes or so, he saw Larry exit the door, lock it, and then limp back towards the car. He was dragging the gray burlap sack at his side, but it was now full and evidently rather heavy. The fact made Ronald smile as he watched Larry struggle with the bag on the icy ground. "Don't hear any alarms or anything. Good work, pal," Ronald called, glancing in his rearview mirror to watch Larry bundling the sack into the trunk of the car. "I'm not stupid," Larry reminded him, limping back around to join Ronald in the car. "Well, that went nice and smoothly," Ronald beamed, punching his friend in the shoulder. "Your turn now. Get us home safe. Don't drive too fast or nothing. We don't want to give any traffic cops a reason to pull us over." "I'm not driving too fast on this ice anyway," Ronald pointed out, eager to turn the engine over and driving away from the factory. "You didn't get snow chains?" "No, Mr. Sensible, I did not. How much did you get in that sack, anyway?" "Everything that was in the safe, which is more than I'd have earned from working there for another decade at least." "Nice work. We take that money to a good bank, or several of them, in fact, say we wanted a casino, morally dubious but perfectly legal, and then put it in a decent investment account, and boom, we're set for life," said Ronald. "You make it sound so simple," Larry said, rubbing the back of his neck to relieve the tension there. "Don't start getting the guilt now, Larry. It's done, and we're gonna live a nice, easy life from now on, a modest one, but easy. We're not fleecing people. We haven't gone around doing repeated robberies to live like kings or nothing. We just done enough so we don't need to worry about keeping a roof over our heads or food on the table. It's fine, all right? It's just." "Yeah, okay," Larry said, sinking back into his chair. Ronald nodded, satisfied the matter was dealt with, and then switched the radio on. The car was now filled with the gentle warmth of Frank Sinatra singing Night and Day. The road ahead was empty. The only thing cutting through the darkness at all were the headlights on Ronald's car. The ground sparkled slightly in the reflection of the light, the frost giving the sheen to the black asphalt below the tires. Snow started to fall softly, the flakes settling on the windscreen. "That's going to get deep fast with this cold," Ronald remarked, switching on the windshield wipers and putting his foot down. The car went over the brow of a small hill, clearing the apex with such speed that the tires left the road for a second. When they found it again, the buildup of ice meant they couldn't regain traction quickly enough, sending the car into a skid. "Shit!" Ronald yelled, frantically turning the wheel against the skidding motion to try and regain control of the vehicle. The car went over the side of the road and head first into the frozen body of water that lay beyond it, the covering of ice splitting open to welcome it. "Shit, shit, shit," Ronald repeated as he unbuckled himself and quickly opened the door before the water started to pour into the car and make the act impossible. "Ron!" Larry grabbed Ronald's wrist, a look of sheer panic on his face. "I can't move my leg. It's gone numb. I'm stuck." "Okay, Ronald stepped back from the car, a dark idea spreading through him as he watched the icy water begin to pour into the car. "You have to get me out." Yeah, of course. Let me just come around to your side, okay?" Ronald assured him, getting out of the slowly sinking car and wading around to the trunk. Larry looked round over his shoulder as Ronald walked round to the back of the car. "Come on, Ronald, come on!" He watched as Ronald opened the trunk of the car, which still protruded from the water as the front was slowly sinking. Ronald removed the gray burlap sack and then closed the trunk and gave the car a push. "Ronald!" Larry screamed, frantically trying to move his leg to exit the car, but the task was growing more difficult every moment with the rising water. Ronald took a few steps back, watching Larry frantically bang against the passenger side window, before the front of the car was completely submerged. Frank Sinatra could just be heard singing night and day as the back of the car disappeared beneath the water. Ronald watched the lake for a few minutes to be completely sure that Larry was done for. If he felt any pangs of conscience about the sudden and dark change of plans, his body language didn't betray it. In fact, he was actually started whistling to himself as he stood there and stared at the frozen lake before he swung the sack over his shoulder, buttoned up his long black coat, then began to walk down the road and continue his journey home. 1 year later. Ronald hummed to himself as he folded clothes and placed them in his brown leather suitcase that lay open on his bed. He was never quite sure how much to pack, but his focus at the moment was on the warmer items in his closet. He decided to take a few days to enjoy the cabin he bought out in the country. The money he'd helped to steal from the factory had served him well. With a sensible investment portfolio, he turned it into enough to live comfortably on for the rest of his life. And with not having to split the take in two, he'd have enough left over to buy himself the cabin. His plan was to spend a week there in winter. He'd do some reading, enjoy the log fire, and perhaps do some hunting. With his thickest scarf packed into the suitcase, Ronald closed the top and pushed it down firmly. A glint of something red caught his eye in the right side of his peripheral vision as he closed the latch. It was a patch of frost in the corner of his bedroom window, and yet the frost had a reddish tint running through it. "Goddamn factory's pumping that crap into the air," Ronald grumbled aloud, shaking his head in dismay. Returning to his suitcase, he lifted it by the handle and went to leave the room. The door handle was cold to touch, enough that he actually snatched his hand away for fear of frostbite. This, in turn, reminded him to grab his leather gloves, which he'd left on the nightstand next to his bed. Walking back around to the bed, he once again came close to the window. The red frost had spread, covering several panes of glass now. The view of the garden through the frosted window was distorted and colored crimson, giving the bare trees and frozen ground a visage that wouldn't look out of place in Dante's epic poem. Ronald shuddered, forced himself to ignore the bizarre weather phenomenon, then grabbed his gloves and left the room. Locking up the house, Ronald noticed that the red frost had also spread to the downstairs windows. He promised himself he would write a letter to the city council about it, as proof of what the local factories must be doing to the air condition. He'd read all about the smog clouds that used to beset London in its heavy manufacturing days, and the post-war boom in America's industries must now surely be at risk of doing the same. Taking care not to slip, Ronald walked down the path to his waiting car. His suitcase fit easily in the trunk and left ample room for his long coat, but Ronald opted to leave this on given how poorly the car's heater usually performed. Settling into the driver's seat, it took 3 attempts to turn the engine over as it battled against the cold, but finally it burst into life, and away he went. Ronald shivered, turning the heater up as far as it would go and taking the moment to tune in the radio. Bing Crosby's voice filled the car, causing Ronald to roll his eyes. He'd never been too fond of Crosby, always preferring Sinatra. He'd had many an argument with Larry over who was the better crooner. Ronald eventually agreed that Crosby was better at the cozy Christmas stuff, but Sinatra was the guy you'd go to for a romantic evening. Recalling the debate, Ronald let his mind cast back over the past year. Men with morals might have lost more sleep over the whole thing than Ronald had, but he had a clean way of smoothing over any gaps in his conscience. The icy water had killed Larry, not him. The car was sinking anyway. He just made it quicker and lessened Larry's torment. No way was he getting out with that bum leg of his. Ronald would have died trying. Better that at least one of them survived. This logic was all it had taken for Ronald to sleep like a baby afterwards. In the weeks that followed, the police investigation had fallen flat. Larry hadn't even been a suspect given his injury and the inability to drive a getaway car. His friendship with Ronald wasn't well known, so it wasn't even as though the police had come knocking at his door. Sure, they'd served together in the war, but so had lots of people. There was a very long list to run down, and frankly, as Ronald himself had suggested, the police didn't want to be seen hassling war vets. Not unless they had an airtight case against one. So it was that the case remained unsolved. Larry's corpse remained stuck in that car at the bottom of the lake to be eaten by fishes, and Ronald bought himself a nice new car. A black Packard Clipper, same as the old one, but a slightly newer model. Newer car or not, the heating system hadn't improved at all. He'd been on the road for half an hour now, and Ronald could still see his breath leaving his cracked lips. His shoulders ached from the tension with which he held himself against the cold, unable to relax into the drive in the way he naturally would if it were warmer inside of the car. A red glint shone in his wing mirror, catching his eye. Ronald glanced at it to see that the corner of the mirror had started to freeze over with the same red frost he had seen at home. A bizarre thought skimmed through his mind that it was as though the crimson frost was following him, but he instantly dismissed that with a shake of the head and an exhalation of air via the nose. The radio crackled and hissed, suddenly louder than it had been before. Ronald frowned and cursed, but before he could reach for the knob to adjust it, the radio had retuned itself. It was the bumpy road. It must be. Whatever song had been playing before, the transmission became clear again halfway through. Frank Sinatra singing Night and Day. A deep chill traveled the length of Ronald's spine, so severe that combined with his firm grip on the steering wheel, it actually made the car swerve for a moment. He brought the car back under control in time to see that the red frost had now started to spread rather rapidly over the windshield. His vision of the road was getting worse every second, the windshield wipers doing nothing but sliding over the frost. "Son of a bitch," Ronald groaned, pulling the car over on the side of the road. Opening the passenger side door, he took the plastic ice scraper tool from the glove compartment and set to work removing the red frost. It came away easily enough, but he was sure that he could see it reforming slowly. He was about halfway through the task, reaching over the screen to do as much as he could before walking around to the other side, when Ronald noticed exactly where it was that he had been forced to pull over. To the left of his car was the same lake in which he'd lost his previous car. This one in which Larry had been stuck in the passenger seat and sank to his death. He wasn't on the same road now. He was passing by the lake from a different route on his journey out of time, but it was the same body of water nonetheless. In fact, as Ronald stared across the water, he more or less convinced himself that directly opposite him, on the other side of the lake, was the spot where the car had gone into the lake from the road. If Larry somehow got out of that car and walked straight forward, limped straight forwards even, he would exit the icy water at the exact spot where Ronald now stood. "Oh, for God's sake, Powell," Ronald chastised himself before continuing to work away at the windshield. Still, feeling a little silly or not for his lapse of rational thought, Ronald allowed his gaze to constantly flick over to the water at his side, to make sure that the surface of it wasn't broken by anything rising from beneath. Once he was satisfied that the windshield was as clear as it was going to be, the red frost already starting to gather again in the corners of the glass, he quickly got back into his car and went on with the drive to his cabin. He didn't once look back at the lake in his rearview mirror for fear of what he might see. Ronald lost control of the vehicle about a mile away from the cabin. The road had become so thick with ice it was like driving on glass. The car's tires couldn't find any purchase, Ronald having neglected once again to purchase snow tires for the winter season. And he was constantly battling with the steering wheel to actually stay on the road. It was a fight he eventually lost as the car skidded off the road entirely and plowed into a ditch. The driver's side door was pressed against a mound of frozen earth, forcing Ronald to climb over the passenger seat to escape the car. Climbing out of the ditch, he opened the trunk of the car and took his suitcase. Taking a step back from the ditch, Ronald surveyed the damage both to himself and the car. There was nothing he could do for the former, although it basically appeared all right. He'd just need a tow truck with a strong winch to come by in the morning and fetch it out. As for himself, his head ached from where he had struck it on the steering wheel, but when he touched his fingertips against it, they didn't come back with any blood. He felt a little woozy, but beyond that, he seemed to have escaped without injury. Glancing down the road, squinting into the darkness, Ronald could just about make out his cabin up ahead. It wasn't far, although his pace was slowed somewhat by the care he was forced to take on the icy road and the frosted ground alongside it. Both the ice and frost glistened red, he noticed, but he was out in the country now, far from the factories and their noxious fumes. Ronald assured himself it was just a result of hitting his head, perhaps just a mild concussion. He'd be warm and resting soon enough. As he walked, he noticed the eerie silence all about him, broken only by the sound of his leather shoes crunching the frozen grass beneath them. He focused on this sound, each footfall taking him closer to the warmth and the comfort of the new cabin. He had a bottle of whiskey in the liquor cabinet there too, he remembered. That would be most welcome tonight. He'd get there, have a drink, sit by the fire and rest. And in the morning, he'd call for a tow truck to get his car. It didn't matter if the front was banged up. He had the money to fix it after all. A satisfied smile spread across his lips as he reminded himself of this fact. And that was when he heard it. A second set of footsteps crunching the frozen grass, almost echoing his own. At first, that's what Ronald thought it was, an echo in the empty night. He actually took a few deliberately loud steps and then stopped, waiting for the echo. His own footfalls were indeed followed by the sound of another's, but they weren't his own. The pace wasn't the same, for one thing. They were staggered, a broken pace. Ronald froze, his blood chilled now by far more than the icy temperature of the night air. He spun around, expecting to see something limping towards him on the road. There was nothing. Nobody else as far as he could see. It's possible they were further back down the road, of course, or they were close enough that he could hear their footsteps. Or if they were close enough that he could hear their frozen footsteps, he'd surely be able to see them as well. Ronald made another cautious footstep, quieter than before, as though he didn't dare tempt the echo. Still, he paused and waited for a response. There wasn't one. He breathed a sigh of relief and walked all the more briskly the remaining distance to the cabin. Ronald double-checked that he locked the door after he entered the cabin, feeling edgy and paranoid given the night's events. It wasn't a logical fear, not really. Yet it was there all the same, chilling his bones even more than the cold had. A cold which seemed to be equally present inside the cabin as it was without. Wasting no time to correct this, Ronald put down his suitcase and immediately went over to the fireplace. There was wood freshly chopped for his arrival, a convenient little service that could be paid for from the groundskeeper. Ronald tossed a few logs on and lit the fire with a match. He stared and watched the fire start to take hold, then removed his gloves and warmed his hands in front of the small flames. Satisfied the fire would soon warm the room, Ronald stood and breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed safer somehow with the fire's warmth. The cold had seemed threatening. As this thought occurred to him, a glint caught his eye once more, this time coming from the cabin window. It was the red frost, already spreading against the glass. Visibly so, in fact. As Ronald got closer, he could see the crimson chill spreading over the window panes in the manner of spilled water, slowly spreading across the tabletop. "Chemicals. The bloody State Department needs to get on this," he said aloud, as though the suggestion of logic might banish the fear that the frost was causing. It wasn't working, despite his internal attempts to convince himself otherwise. The fireplace no longer seemed like enough, so Ronald now went into the kitchen and bedrooms and lit both of the gas-powered heaters. He also took the opportunity to triple-check every window was closed and locked, and that the door to the cabin remained so as well. This apparent security didn't bring Ronald any comfort, though. As the ice had spread to the windows upstairs as well, it now seemed like it covered the entirety of the outside of the house. Ronald returned to the living room, still wearing his long coat, as he stood in front of the fireplace, shivering. He could see his breath before his face. The cold was seeping through the walls. Poorly insulated cabin, he told himself. It had to be. He cursed the silence, feeling like every creak of the expanding floorboards, every pop and crackle of the fire, was now an affront to his nervous state. That silence was broken by the sudden music emanating from the wireless radio that rested atop the mantelpiece. It hadn't been turned on, nor had Ronald touched it, yet still music started to come from it. Frank Sinatra's voice was distorted, the effect somehow stripping it of its usual warmth and replacing it with malice. Ronald grabbed the radio and went to turn the dial back to off, except that he couldn't, because it was already turned off. Panic and confusion rose in him, causing him to throw the radio down onto the hardwood floor and smash it with his foot. Again and again he stamped on it until it was just shards and broken parts. Sinatra's voice stopped, but the atmosphere of the cabin was none the warmer for it. Ronald ran into the kitchen, opened one of the cupboards, and took out a wooden box. From it, he took as many thick candles as he could carry, then quickly ran around the cabin, standing them up and lighting them. Heat and light, that's what this place needed, he thought. He lit every last candle he could find, yet the oppressive cold of the cabin remained unchanged. There was no draft, but the air was filled with a constant chill that made it impossible to get comfortable. His body shook. He contemplated leaving, but that meant going back out there where the red frost was. No car, nowhere to go, all that cold, open, dark. No, inside the cabin was safer, he assured himself. Exactly what he was trying to procure safety against was a thought that he hadn't allowed himself to fully form. Madness lies that way, he knew. The brand new hunting rifle he'd purchased had been safely locked away in his display cabinet. Ronald removed it now and loaded it for the first time. He'd planned to hunt some deer or turkeys, but now the rifle was loaded for protection. That was what he told himself as he readied it, but how it might serve that purpose was another unanswered question. With the rifle firmly gripped, Ronald went and sat on the floor by the fire, as close to it as he could. He kept his eye fixed on the door and the windows, watching for any sign of he didn't even know what. The red frost was thick on the windows, so thick he could barely see out of them now. He could see enough, though. If anything moved by that window and approached the door, then he would see it. For the first time since this bizarre evening had begun, Ronald actually focused on what was happening, thinking about the night as a whole instead of just reacting to each event as it came up. The car shield froze, so he scraped it off. His car crashed, so he got out and walked to the cabin. The cabin was cold, so he lit the fire, the gas heaters and all the candles. He felt unsafe, so loaded a weapon and kept it close. All reactions to the current situation, just like a soldier. You couldn't untrain that. But now it was precisely his time as a soldier that Ronald focused on. Was this a new symptom of his shell shock? The past year he'd been free of episodes. Was this long overdue one returning with a vengeance to shatter his mind? Ronald rocked back and forth slightly. "I'm not crazy. I'm not," he said aloud. The crackle of the fire at his side went silent, replaced with a dry, cracking noise. Slowly, despairingly, he turned to look at it. The fire itself had frozen. The flames held solid in red ice, lay present and glowing beneath it, and like an illuminated glass sculpture. Ronald could see his reflection in it as he stared. "No, that's not possible." Ronald flipped the rifle in his hands and reached toward the frozen flames with the butt of the gun. He tapped it, cautiously at first. It was solid. He struck it harder now, intending to free the flames so they might once again bring him some warmth. The ice cracked a little, so he struck it again. On the third blow, the flames shattered, sending shards of red ice violently outwards. Some struck Ronald in the eyes, causing him to fall back in pain on the floor. His vision was blurry now, his eyes searing. He could make out the larger shapes of the cabin, but nothing more clearly than that. As the ice had struck him, he dropped the rifle, and upon realizing this, his thoughts instantly turned to retrieving it. The fact he couldn't see clear to aim it didn't deter his desperation to once again hold the rifle. The fire was gone. The rifle was his best chance at staying safe. Ronald looked this way and that, painfully squinting his eyes to try and clear them. He got to his feet, then slipped and fell face first back to the hard wooden floor. It felt colder now as he lay against it. Even with his blurred vision, he could see that the floor of the cabin was now covered with red frost. It wasn't stopping there, though. It had started to spread across the walls, too, reaching up towards the ceiling. Spotting the rifle lying on the ground to his right, Ronald started to drag himself along the floor to reach it. His ribs hurt where he'd fallen to the floor. He daren't risk standing again. Ronald was close to the rifle, within grabbing distance of it, when he found that his hand was now stuck to the floor. So cold was the ice that his skin had frozen against it. Worse still, as he turned to see that this had happened, the side of his face became similarly stuck. Ronald lifted his cheek away with all his strength, screaming as his skin was torn from it and left behind on the floor. The agony caused him to fall back down, struck against the red frost, and sobbing in terror. The cabin door swung open with such force that the top hinge broke away, and the door hung downwards at an awkward angle. A shape stood in the doorway, shabby, rotten, and covered in red frost. Even with his blurred vision, Ronald was in no doubt about who it was. He screamed, unable to move himself from the floor, as the frozen, undead thing began to walk towards him with a very pronounced limp. I hope that you enjoyed Red Frost by Lex H. Jones. Happy holidays!